The Indigenous Navigator, Data by Indigenous Peoples. What is the Indigenous Navigator? The Indigenous Navigator is a framework and set of tools for and by Indigenous peoples to systematically monitor the level of recognition and implementation of their rights. By using the Indigenous Navigator, Indigenous organizations and communities, duty bearers, NGOs or non-governmental organizations, and journalists can access free tools and resources based on the community's generated data. The Indigenous Navigator monitors the implementation of the following. The first is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The second is core human rights conventions as they pertain to Indigenous peoples, including essential aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, it monitors the outcomes of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007 and covers the full range of Indigenous peoples' rights, including rights to lands, territories and resources, self-determination, participation in public affairs, health, education, general economic and social development, access to justice, and customary law, among others. During its 16th session in April to May of 2017, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues recommended and encouraged governments, United Nations agencies, Indigenous peoples, and civil society organizations to use the Indigenous Navigator framework and tools in order to strengthen community-based monitoring of global commitments. What is the purpose and how is the Indigenous Navigator used? The Indigenous Navigator is used to document the human rights and development situation of Indigenous peoples, and by doing so, it is taking a first step towards discussing these rights and development situations with duty bearers and other external stakeholders. The Indigenous Navigator has been specifically developed in response to the need for quality data that can be fed into existing human rights and sustainable development monitoring processes at the local, national, and international levels. As Indigenous people create data, they feed into the human rights instruments and human rights monitoring bodies, and the state is also able to feed into the discussion through the ratification and reporting, as well as receiving comments and recommendations. The tools here facilitate Indigenous communities' own generation of quality data on their situation and simultaneously enhances their awareness of their rights. The Indigenous community data aims at making implementation gaps visible. By documenting and reporting their situation, Indigenous peoples can enhance their access to justice and to development. The Indigenous Navigator can serve a number of purposes. For example, it can raise awareness of Indigenous communities about their rights, sensitizing them and contributing to their empowerment and ability to claim those rights. It can also deliver data on Indigenous peoples' human rights and development situation to UN agencies and UN mechanisms addressing Indigenous peoples' rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights, the MRIP process, and the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. The Indigenous Navigator's data can also guide and orient Indigenous peoples' self-determined governance and development strategies. Through collecting of evidence and documentation, it can evidence whether states are complying with the commitments they made at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the WCIP. It can also be used to hold states accountable by evidencing their compliance with or failure to meet human rights obligations with regards to Indigenous peoples. And it can be used to guide and orient development policies and development programs, including those designed to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. For a little background on the Indigenous Navigator, we can start by explaining what the origin was. For years, Indigenous organizations and experts have called upon states to disaggregate human rights and development data in order to uncover injustices and social exclusion. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has repeatedly called for enhanced monitoring of the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, including through disaggregated data and development of specific indicators for assessing its implementation in a systematic way. The Indigenous Navigator itself has emerged in response to these discussions and is a collaboration and collaborative initiative of 6 partners: the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, or AIPP, the Forest Peoples Program, or FPP, the International Labour Organization, or ILO, the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, known as IWGIA, TebtebbaFoundation, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. The Indigenous Navigator's tools were tested in collaboration with partners in Cameroon, Kenya, Suriname, Peru, Nepal, and Thailand from 2014 to 2015. In its second phase, from 2017 to 2019, the consortium has been working with partners in Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Suriname, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, the Philippines, Cameroon, Kenya, and Tanzania on applying the tools. This is an ongoing work, and it includes continued community-based generation of data on Indigenous peoples' human rights and development situation, as well as national and international advocacy work. Thank you for watching and joining us today for this brief overview of the Indigenous Navigator project. Would you like to find out more? If so, and if you're interested in further information, please contact us at info@indigenousnavigator.org, or please visit us at www.indigenousnavigator.org.